Shaam ki rang, registan raah, uski nazar or andaazmeinchhupi wo kashishjo bana. Fire. The sun hung low in the sky, spilling a golden-orange light over the endless desert. The dunes stretched far and wide, rolling like waves frozen in time, their peaks casting long shadows that moved slowly with the fading light. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of dry sand and something wild that belonged only to the desert. It was the kind of place that made the world feel both immense and quiet, as if time itself had decided to slow down to watch the wind dance over the grains of sand. Arv stepped off the narrow dirt road, his boots crunching softly against the hard, sun-warmed earth. He paused for a moment, closing his eyes and letting the silence wrap around him. It was not the emptiness of loneliness, but a stillness that had a voice of its own, gentle, inviting and mysterious. The desert had called him here for days now in his dreams, each night painting visions of endless golden sands, a path leading somewhere unknown, and a quiet presence waiting at the horizon. Now, standing at the edge of the desert, those visions seemed to shimmer on the very air around him. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and began walking. Each step sent small clouds of fine sand swirling around his ankles. The wind, soft and warm, teased his hair and carried whispers that seemed to come from the heart of the desert itself. Arv had traveled through many cities, forests, and hills, but there was something different about this place, something raw and alive that touched him in a way he could not explain. The desert felt like a mirror, reflecting not just the landscape but the quiet corners of his own mind and heart. As he walked further, the sunlight began to soften, painting the dunes in shades of pink, orange, and purple. The sky seemed like a canvas on fire, with clouds catching the last light of the day, stretching endlessly into the distance. And then, in the midst of this quiet beauty, he saw her. She was standing near a tall dune, her silhouette framed by the colors of the setting sun. She didn't move, didn't speak, yet there was an energy around her that seemed to pull at the very air. Arv stopped in his tracks, his heart catching in his chest. There was something in the way she held herself, calm, unhurried, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, and though she didn't look at him, he felt as if her eyes had already noticed him, measuring him, understanding him in a way words could never achieve. He wondered briefly if she had been expecting him too, if she was part of the story his dreams had been hinting at. His curiosity was mixed with hesitation. The desert could be overwhelming, even lonely, and he didn't want to intrude on her solitude. Yet something inside him urged him forward, step by step, drawn by a pull he couldn't name. Arv began walking toward her, careful not to disturb the stillness around him. Each footfall was slow, deliberate, like a dance with the sand beneath him. He noticed the way her hair caught the sunlight, turning shades of copper and gold, and the way her shadow stretched across the dune, long and elegant. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence, but he felt her awareness like a gentle current in the air. As he got closer, he saw more details. The way her hands rested lightly at her sides, relaxed yet poised, and the way her eyes, even without looking directly at him, seemed to hold entire stories in their depth. Arv had never met anyone who could hold such a presence without saying a single word. He felt both nervous and mesmerized. It was as if she belonged to the desert itself, an echo of its beauty and quiet mystery. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the sand and brushing against his face. Arv shielded his eyes with one hand and took a deep breath. The air smelled of warmth and earth, of a place untouched by hurried footsteps and daily chaos. The sound of the wind was soft but persistent, whispering secrets only the desert knew. He realized that the silence around her wasn't emptiness. It was rich, full of stories waiting to be discovered. He took another step forward. The closer he got, the more he felt an unusual calm settle over him. The usual rush of thoughts, worries, and plans faded, replaced by a single awareness. He wanted to know her story, even if she never spoke it aloud. There was a kind of gravity in her presence that didn't demand attention but still commanded it, quietly and powerfully. For a long moment, they stood there, separated by a few meters of sand, two figures bathed in the last light of day. Arav noticed the tiniest details, the faint crease of concentration on her forehead, the gentle tilt of her head as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Her quietness was not emptiness but a language, one that spoke of patience, resilience, and experiences too deep for ordinary conversation. He wanted to speak, to break the silence, but words felt fragile against the enormity of the scene around him. Instead, he simply walked a little closer, letting the silence itself act as a bridge. The desert seemed to approve, its wind swirling around them like soft applause, carrying with it the scent of freedom and distant possibilities. Finally, she turned slightly, not to face him directly, but enough for her profile to catch the fading light. Arav's breath hitched. There was a calm strength in her expression, a quiet confidence that didn't seek validation, yet it drew him in irresistibly. For the first time in years, he felt entirely present in a moment, no distractions, no noise, just the connection between two humans and the vastness of the world around them. A few minutes passed like hours. Arav didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless words. He simply let himself exist there, in the soft glow of twilight, sharing the desert with her, sharing the unseen space between them that was already full of possibility. There was a story here, he realized, a story he might never fully understand, but one that had already begun to touch him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in deep shades of red and violet, Arav felt a strange mixture of anticipation and contentment. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if he would ever speak to her, yet the memory of this moment, the light, the sand, the quiet intensity of her presence, would remain with him forever. The desert had given him a glimpse of something rare, something timeless, and he knew that the journey he had just begun was about far more than crossing sand or reaching a destination. He finally spoke softly, as if testing the sound against the evening air. "Hello." She didn't turn immediately, but her eyes met his just for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, a story began, one that the desert would witness, one that would unfold slowly, and one that neither of them would forget. And with that, Arav took another step, letting the silence, the twilight, and the golden sands guide him forward, toward whatever the desert had in store. The sky had transformed completely since Arav had first seen her. What had been golden and soft now turned deep shades of purple and crimson, fading slowly into the inky blue of early night. Stars began to appear, shyly at first, then more confidently, sprinkled across the vast canvas above. The desert seemed to hum quietly under the blanket of dusk, and the wind, though still gentle, carried a slightly cooler touch, as if preparing the world for the calm of night. Arav felt a strange thrill mixed with hesitation. He had never been one to chase shadows or illusions, but there was something about her, the way she had stood there, still yet commanding, the way her eyes had hinted at stories untold, that made him want to step closer. And so he did. Step by careful step, the sand shifting softly beneath his feet, he followed the curve of the dunes, keeping a respectful distance but never letting the space between them stretch too far. She had begun walking slowly, almost as if the desert itself guided her steps. Arav's heart quickened, not from fear, but from an excitement he could not fully name. He had expected her to vanish like a mirage, a vision of the fading sunlight, but she remained tangible, real, and mesmerizing. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, yet effortless, as if the desert and she had always known each other. Arav finally spoke again, his voice soft, almost swallowed by the vastness around them. "Are you going somewhere?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, where the last glow of the sun lingered like an ember about to fade. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she turned her face toward him, enough to reveal a faint smile, gentle and fleeting, like a secret shared only with the wind. "I walk," she said softly, her voice carrying over the soft rustle of the sand. "The desert is quiet, it listens." Her words were simple, yet they felt profound. Arev realized that she spoke not to fill the silence but to honor it. The quiet around them wasn't something to be broken. It was something to experience, to move through, like a path leading to the heart of the world. He nodded, unsure if she noticed, and fell into step behind her, matching her pace without thinking about it. The air grew cooler as night began to settle fully, and the stars shone brighter. For a while, they walked without speaking. Arev found that the silence was not awkward, but alive, filled with the sound of sand shifting under their feet, the distant call of a desert bird returning to its nest, and the soft sighs of the wind. In this quiet, he began to notice details he might have missed before. The way her hair caught the faint light of the stars, the delicate movements of her hands as she brushed sand away from her path, the calm rhythm of her footsteps that seemed to echo the pulse of the desert itself. After some time, he dared to speak again, choosing his words carefully. "Do you come here often?" she chuckled softly, a sound that was lighter than the wind and warmer than the evening air. "Not often," she admitted. "But when I do, it feels like the desert remembers me." Her gaze shifted for a moment to the horizon, and Arev could see a depth in her eyes, a mixture of longing and peace, a story hinted at but not yet told. He wanted to ask more, to know what she meant, but he stopped himself. There was a rhythm to their walk, a silent understanding that some things revealed themselves in time. Instead, he nodded, letting the words rest unspoken, and simply walked beside her, sharing the space, the sand, and the slowly darkening sky. As they moved deeper into the dunes, Arev noticed small signs of life around them. A cluster of desert flowers, delicate and surprisingly vibrant, peeked out from the sand. A lizard darted across their path, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Even the wind seemed to change subtly, brushing against them with a softer touch, as if to welcome them into a more intimate part of the desert. Mira paused occasionally, pointing out something she found beautiful or interesting, never forcing attention, but inviting it gently. Arev found himself listening with a sense of wonder, absorbing not just her words, but the way she connected with every detail of the world around them. At one point, they reached a small rise, a dune that offered a panoramic view of the desert stretching endlessly beneath the starlight. Mira stopped and crouched slightly, resting her hands on her knees. Arev mirrored her, sitting a few feet away, careful not to invade her space but close enough to feel a shared presence. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was comfortable, even comforting, a companion in its own right. Arev watched as Mira tilted her head, eyes scanning the horizon, and he realized that she was listening to the desert in a way he had never understood before. He could see the faintest movements of her lips, as if she were speaking softly to the wind, sharing her thoughts, her memories, or maybe just acknowledging the beauty around her. "I like this part," she said finally, her voice soft, almost blending with the night. "The desert feels endless but not lonely. Do you feel that too?" Arev thought about it for a moment, searching for words that would do justice to the feeling. "Yes," he said simply. "It's like being part of something bigger than ourselves, quiet but alive." She nodded slightly, and for the first time he felt a sense of connection that went beyond words. It was as if they had discovered a shared understanding, a language of presence and attention that made everything else fade away. The desert, with its vastness and quiet, had created a space where two strangers could walk together and yet feel as if they had always known each other. The night deepened, and the stars seemed to shine brighter with every step they took. Arev realized that time had lost its usual meaning. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like moments. They moved together through the sand, sometimes pausing to admire the shifting patterns of the dunes, sometimes speaking in hushed tones about small wonders, a particularly bright star, a rare flower, the soft sound of distant wind. He noticed her hands again, delicate and expressive, brushing sand off a tiny cactus, or holding a handful of grains to let them slip slowly through her fingers. There was a grace in her movements that spoke of patience, of someone who had learned to move with the world rather than against it. Arev felt a quiet admiration growing in him, not just for her beauty, but for the way she embraced the simplicity and complexity of the desert at the same time. At one point, they reached a small oasis, a tiny patch of greenery surrounded by sand. The water reflected the stars above, creating a shimmering mirror that seemed almost magical. Mira knelt beside it, cupping water in her hands and letting it trickle back into the pool. Arev followed, doing the same, and for a moment the world seemed suspended in perfect balance. Two people, a pool of water, a sky full of stars, and the endless desert around them. "This is beautiful," Arev said softly, more to himself than to her. Mira smiled, the kind of smile that felt like sunlight warming the cold corners of the night. "Yes," she agreed. "The desert holds many small miracles. You just have to notice them." Arev nodded, realizing that he was beginning to understand not just the desert, but the woman who moved through it with such quiet grace. She wasn't trying to impress or entertain. She simply existed, fully aware and present, and that presence was enough to make everything around her feel alive. As they continued walking, the night air grew cooler, and Arev felt the faint brush of wind against his face. He stole a glance at her, noticing how she moved with an ease that seemed entirely natural, as if the dunes themselves bent slightly to welcome her steps. The pull he had felt when he first saw her was no longer mysterious. It was real, tangible, yet gentle, like the desert's own heartbeat. For the first time, Arev felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he was seeking. The world beyond the dunes, with its noise and rush and constant demands, seemed distant and irrelevant. Here, under the vast sky and among the endless sand, he was part of a story that was unfolding slowly, quietly, and beautifully. And even though they had not yet shared the details of their lives, their fears, or their dreams, Arev understood something essential. Sometimes connection does not need words. Sometimes it is the shared journey, the silent presence, the mutual attention to small wonders that forms the deepest bonds. As they walked side by side, the desert night embracing them, Arev felt certain that this was only the beginning. Whatever stories lay in her eyes, whatever paths had led her here, and whatever awaited them further along the dunes, he was ready to discover it, one step at a time. And so, beneath a sky sprinkled with stars, two souls moved together across the desert, their footsteps in the sand leaving temporary marks that would fade but whose memory would linger, a quiet promise of stories yet to be told. The night had settled fully over the desert now, and the stars hung like tiny lanterns scattered across a vast, dark ceiling. The air was cooler, carrying the gentle scent of dry sand and distant shrubs. Arev and Mira continued their slow walk along the rolling dunes, their footsteps blending softly with the whisper of the wind. It was a journey not measured by distance but by moments, each one small, quiet, and significant. Arev found himself increasingly aware of her presence beside him. It was not a presence that demanded attention. It was subtle, calm, yet profoundly compelling. She seemed to move in harmony with the desert, as if every step was guided by the rhythm of the wind and the shifting sands. He realized that the desert itself had shaped her, given her this quiet strength and unspoken grace. At one point, Mira stopped near a small rise in the dunes and crouched down. Arev followed her instinctively, sitting a few feet away. She picked up a handful of sand and let it slip slowly through her fingers, watching the grains scatter into the night. "It's strange," she said softly, "how something so simple can feel so alive." Arav looked at her, curious. "Alive?" he asked. She nodded, letting the sand fall completely before looking at him. "Yes, each grain has a story. Each movement of the wind, each shift of the dunes, it's all alive in its own way. You just have to notice it." He thought about that for a moment. He had always noticed the big things, cities, mountains, oceans, but the small, quiet things often went unseen. Here, in the desert with her, he began to understand a new way of seeing the world. Even the smallest details felt significant, meaningful, almost sacred. As they continued walking, the conversation deepened naturally, without pressure or expectation. Arav found himself asking questions he would normally have hesitated to ask, and Mira answered with a calm honesty that invited reflection rather than judgment. They spoke about the desert, about the stars, about small memories from their lives. She never revealed too much at once, but each detail she shared seemed to carry weight, as if she were choosing her words carefully, like a painter selecting the perfect colors for a canvas. Arav noticed that she had a habit of observing before speaking and listening before responding. Her eyes took in everything around her, the slight curve of a dune, the faint shimmer of a cactus flower, the subtle shift in the wind. It was as if she absorbed the desert in a way that made her more present, more alive, more connected to everything around her. Arav found himself wanting to see the world through her eyes, to understand the depth of attention and care she brought to even the smallest things. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the soft, earthy scent of the desert deeper into their path. Mira adjusted the scarf around her neck, her fingers brushing lightly over the fabric. Arav noticed how attentive she was to her surroundings, how every gesture was deliberate but natural. It made him realize that there was a quiet strength in her, a strength not announced loudly, but expressed in the way she moved, observed, and chose to be fully present. They came across a small patch of desert grass, stubborn and green against the endless sand. Mira knelt beside it, running her fingers lightly through the blades. "Life finds a way," she whispered, almost to herself. "Even here, where nothing seems possible, it grows." Arav smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "It's beautiful," he said. "You notice things others might overlook." She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Perhaps," she said softly. "Or perhaps I've learned that the smallest things often carry the greatest stories." The conversation left him thoughtful. He realized that this journey wasn't just about walking through the desert. It was about learning to see, to notice, and to feel. Every moment with her felt like a lesson in awareness, patience, and quiet appreciation. He found himself slowing down, letting go of the rush of thoughts that usually filled his mind, and simply being present. The moon had risen now, casting a soft silver light over the dunes. Shadows stretched long and mysterious, and the sand shimmered faintly, like a blanket of scattered diamonds. The night was alive with gentle sounds, the rustle of the wind, the distant call of a desert bird, the soft scuff of their feet against the sand. Arav realized that he was beginning to feel at home in this quiet world, as if the desert had claimed a small piece of his heart. Mira paused on another dune, looking up at the sky. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "how small we are in all of this? And yet how much we can feel?" Arav followed her gaze. The stars seemed endless, stretching in every direction, and he felt the vastness of the universe pressing gently against his awareness. "I do," he admitted. "It's humbling but also comforting in a way." She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Yes. There's a kind of peace in knowing that we are small and that the world goes on around us, beautiful and indifferent. And yet, our moments, our awareness can still matter, even here, even now." He nodded, feeling a strange sense of closeness to her, even though their conversation was sparse. It was as if the desert itself encouraged honesty, stripped away pretense, and left only what was real. The more they walked, the more he realized that he was beginning to understand not just her, but himself, his thoughts, his quiet desires, his need to connect, and his capacity to be patient, observant, and fully present. Hours seemed to pass without the weight of time pressing on them. The desert had a way of making moments stretch, of giving space for reflection and presence. Arav noticed the subtle changes in Mira, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the way she occasionally brushed sand off her boots, the gentle curve of her smile when she noticed something beautiful. Each detail, small and fleeting, drew him closer, not with urgency but with a deep, abiding curiosity. At one point, they reached a small dune that offered a breathtaking view of the desert stretching endlessly beneath the moonlight. Mira crouched lightly, gazing out at the horizon, and Arav sat nearby, careful to respect her space but wanting to share the view. "It never ends," she whispered, almost to herself. "No," he agreed softly, "and yet it doesn't feel empty." She looked at him then, her eyes calm but intense. "That's the secret," she said. "The desert teaches you to see life in spaces others might call empty. It teaches you patience. It teaches you to notice what matters." Arav realized then that he had been learning without even trying. This journey was not about reaching a destination, but about discovering how to be fully awake to the world, and how to value moments that might otherwise pass unnoticed. As they began to move again, a gentle wind swept across the dunes, lifting grains of sand into the air. Mira laughed softly, a sound like the wind itself, and Arav felt a warmth in his chest. It was a sound that spoke of joy, of freedom, and of a rare lightness of being that he had seldom experienced. They walked on, side by side, sharing the night and the desert in silence more often than in words. And yet, each silence was filled with meaning. Every glance, every step, every small gesture was part of a conversation that required no speech. Arav felt the bond between them deepen, not in a rush, but gradually, steadily, like water carving a path through sand, invisible yet undeniable. By the time the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, painting the desert in soft hues of pink and gold, Arav and Mira were still walking. Their steps were slower now, reflective, as if the desert had given them a night to explore not just the world around them, but the world within themselves. And in that shared journey, Arav understood something important. Sometimes, the most profound connections are not about words or grand gestures. They are about presence, observation, and quiet companionship. They are about noticing the small miracles of life, sharing them without expectation, and walking together even when the path ahead is uncertain. The desert had given him more than a view of endless sand and stars. It had given him a companion in Mira, someone whose quiet presence was a mirror to his own awakening. And as they walked, Arav knew that this was only the beginning of a journey, one that would continue, step by step, moment by moment, across the ever-shifting sands. The first light of dawn began to seep over the desert, painting the dunes in soft shades of pink and amber. The chill of the night slowly gave way to the gentle warmth of the early sun. Arav and Mira had been walking for hours, their footsteps leaving delicate imprints on the sand, only to be erased gradually by the wind. There was a quiet serenity in the air, a sense of calm that made even the smallest sounds, the whisper of the wind, the scuff of sand beneath their feet, feel like music. Arav noticed that Mira walked with a slightly different rhythm this morning. She was quieter than usual, her gaze distant, fixed on some invisible point beyond the horizon. Her steps were careful, almost as if she were carrying a weight he could not yet see. Arav matched her pace, respecting her silence, yet a quiet curiosity stirred within him. He had grown used to her presence over the past night, to the subtle conversations, the shared moments of silence, and the way she noticed the world so differently. But now, he sensed something deeper, something she had not yet revealed. Finally, after walking for a while, they reached a small hollow between two dunes, sheltered from the wind. Mira stopped and turned slightly, her profile catching the soft light of dawn. Arev sat a short distance away, his eyes following her every movement, careful not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. The silence stretched, but it was no longer the gentle, neutral silence of shared presence. There was tension now, a quiet heaviness that made the desert feel stiller, almost attentive. Mira sighed softly, the sound barely audible over the whispering wind. "There's something I should tell you," she said, her voice hesitant but steady. "Something I haven't shared with anyone in a long time." Arev felt a sudden mix of anticipation and concern. He nodded slowly, encouraging her without speaking. There was no rush, no demand for explanation, only a quiet openness, the kind that invited trust. She paused, taking a deep breath, as if preparing herself to step across a vast emotional distance. "I didn't always wander the desert," she began. "There was a time when I was tied to a world very different from this one. A world filled with noise, expectations, and attachments. I had someone I cared for deeply, someone I thought would always be with me. But life has a way of changing things that you never expect." Arev listened intently, sensing the weight in her words. Her voice was calm, but beneath it he could feel the tremor of memories she had carried alone for years. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the silence. He simply allowed her story to unfold, step by step, like the dunes before them. "They were everything to me," she continued, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "We dreamed together, laughed together, and imagined a future that felt certain. But then one day they were gone. No warning, no chance to say goodbye properly. Just gone. The world I had known, the life I had built in my mind, disappeared in a single moment." Arev's heart tightened. He had felt sadness before, but hearing it spoken so openly, so vulnerably, created a resonance he could not ignore. He felt a desire to comfort her, to offer some word of solace, but he knew that words would be inadequate. Some pain was not meant to be erased, only acknowledged. Mira's gaze softened slightly, though her eyes still reflected a depth of grief. "I came to the desert because it's honest," she said quietly. "The wind doesn't lie, the sand doesn't pretend, and the night sky doesn't demand anything from you. Here, I can be myself. I can remember, I can feel, and yet I can also let go slowly without anyone telling me how or when. The desert holds space for loss, for silence, and for healing." Arev nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. "I think I understand," he said softly. "It's not about forgetting. It's about finding a way to keep living, to keep moving forward even when the past is heavy." She turned to look at him fully then, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger, no expectation, only honesty. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. And sometimes it helps to walk with someone who doesn't try to fix it, someone who just shares the path." Arev felt a warmth spread through his chest, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust she was placing in him. He had never met anyone who could convey so much without demanding anything in return. And in that moment, he realized that their shared journey had become more than a walk across sand. It had become a shared experience of presence, patience, and understanding. They continued walking, side by side, though neither spoke for a long while. The desert seemed to respond to their silence, the soft light of dawn reflecting off the dunes, turning them into waves of gold and rose. The wind carried the faint scent of distant shrubs and earth, filling the air with a quiet freshness. Each step felt deliberate, each movement meaningful, as if the desert itself was honoring the vulnerability shared between them. As the morning light strengthened, Arev noticed that Mira's steps were lighter now. The burden of her story had not disappeared, but sharing it seemed to have lifted a weight, even slightly. There was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet grace that spoke of resilience and acceptance. He realized that her past, as painful as it had shaped her, giving her strength, patience, and the capacity to connect with the world in a deeply attentive way. They came across a small cluster of desert flowers, their petals soft and vibrant against the sand. Mira knelt to examine them, brushing her fingers gently over their delicate surfaces. Arav knelt beside her, sharing the moment, feeling a connection not just to her, but to the quiet beauty of life persevering even in harsh conditions. "The desert is full of surprises," Mira said softly, her voice reflective. "Even in the emptiest places, life finds a way. And so do we, eventually." Arav nodded, understanding that the desert was not just a setting but a teacher. It mirrored their journey, vast, challenging, sometimes lonely, yet filled with unexpected beauty and growth. He realized that by sharing her past, Mira had allowed him into her world, into a space of trust and openness that was rare and precious. They walked on, the sun climbing higher, casting long, soft shadows over the dunes. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but companionable, filled with mutual understanding. Each glance, each gesture, each careful step was part of a dialogue that required no words, a communication that was honest and unhurried. At one point, Arav noticed a slight smile on Mira's face, fleeting but real. He realized then that her journey through the desert, though born of loss, was also a journey toward rediscovery, of self, of trust, and of the quiet joys that life could still offer. And in that moment, he felt privileged to witness it, to walk beside her, to share in the delicate balance of vulnerability and strength. The desert continued to unfold around them, vast and endless, yet intimate in the way it framed their journey. Each dune, each shadow, each glimmer of sunlight felt like a witness to the stories being shared and the connection being formed. Arav felt a sense of awe not just at the landscape, but at the depth of human experience that could exist in quiet spaces, in shared silence, and in moments of trust. By the time the sun was fully risen, painting the sand in warm golden tones, Arav and Mira paused on a high dune, looking out over the endless expanse. She turned to him, her eyes calm but reflective. "Thank you," she said softly, "for walking with me, for listening, for being here." Arav felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of humility and gratitude. "No," he said quietly, "thank you for trusting me, for sharing your story. I feel honored." For a long moment, they simply stood there, two figures against the vast desert, the wind carrying the remnants of night and the promise of the day ahead. The desert had witnessed countless journeys, countless stories of loss, love, and discovery. And now it bore witness to theirs, a story of trust, understanding, and the quiet magic of being fully present for one another. As they finally began to move again, the desert stretching endlessly before them, Arav realized that their journey had changed him. He saw not just the beauty of the landscape, but the depth of human resilience, the power of shared silence, and the subtle ways in which connection could transform even the loneliest path. And Mira, walking beside him with a calm grace that belied the weight of her past, seemed to carry not just her memories, but also a sense of hope, hope that life could continue, that beauty could be found even in the harshest places, and that some bonds, however quiet or unexpected, could leave a lasting imprint on the heart. The sun had fully risen over the desert, casting a golden glow that turned every dune into a soft, rolling sea of light. The warmth of the morning touched Arav's face as he walked beside Mira, their shadows stretching long across the sand. The chill of night had disappeared, replaced by the gentle heat that the desert offered in the early hours. Everything felt alive, the wind, the sand, even the quiet hum of the vast, open space around them. Arav noticed that the desert looked different now than it had the night before. Back then, the dunes had seemed infinite and mysterious, almost intimidating in their vastness. But now, in the soft morning light, they seemed welcoming, full of gentle curves and shadows that invited exploration rather than solitude. And it occurred to him that this was much like the journey he and Mira had taken, moving from the unknown, the uncertainty, to a place of shared understanding and quiet connection. They walked in silence for a while, letting the rhythm of their footsteps match the subtle pulse of the desert. The wind played softly with Mira's scarf, and Arev noticed the faint smile on her face, the way her eyes caught the sunlight as she scanned the horizon. For the first time, he felt that the desert was not only a place of solitude, but a place of clarity. Here, with her beside him, he felt both present and free, as if the vastness around them had the power to stretch the limits of thought and heart. Eventually, Mira paused on a high dune, turning to look back toward the distant village where their journey had begun. The buildings were tiny specks now, almost lost against the endless sand. Arev stood quietly beside her, observing the landscape as she did. "It's strange," she said softly, her voice carrying over the gentle wind. "The desert feels the same, yet different every time you see it, and it reminds me life is like that too. Even when things change, even when paths split, there's a constant rhythm, a way to keep moving forward." Arev nodded. He felt a deep understanding in her words. Over the past hours, he had witnessed not only her journey through grief and solitude, but also the quiet strength that had carried her forward. And he realized that this journey had changed him too, teaching him patience, presence, and the subtle beauty of noticing life without rushing to define it. They began walking again, descending a gentle slope that led to a small oasis hidden between two dunes. The water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting the sky above like a mirror, and the desert plants around it added splashes of green to the otherwise golden landscape. Mira knelt beside the water, cupping it gently in her hands before letting it fall back with a quiet splash. Arev joined her, feeling the coolness of the water against his palms, and he noticed the calm and balance that seemed to surround her. "This place," Mira said softly, "it always reminds me that even in the harshest conditions, life finds a way. And even in the hardest moments, hope can survive." Arev looked at her, feeling the truth of her words settle inside him. He had seen her resilience, her quiet courage, and her ability to find beauty even after loss. And now, seeing her interact with the oasis, he understood that the desert had not only shaped her, but had also offered her a path toward healing. For a long while, they sat there in companionable silence, the wind whispering gently around them, the water reflecting the light in delicate patterns. Arev realized that there was a rhythm to this journey, a flow that did not need to be interrupted by words. Their presence together had become a dialogue of its own, measured in glances, gestures, and shared observation. As the morning progressed, Arev knew that soon they would have to part ways. The village lay several hours away, and their journey through the desert was coming to an end. Yet, there was no sadness in this realization, only a quiet acknowledgement that some experiences, once shared, leave an enduring mark even when paths diverge. Mira stood first, brushing the sand from her clothes, and Arev followed. They walked together toward the edge of the oasis, the dunes rising and falling like gentle waves on either side. Arev felt a bittersweet mix of gratitude and longing. He was grateful for the time spent with her, for the trust she had shown, and for the lessons he had absorbed. Yet he felt a quiet longing too, a wish that their journey could continue a little longer, even if only in shared silence. Finally, they reached the edge of the dunes where the village appeared in the distance. The sounds of life, distant voices, the faint clatter of daily activity began to filter through the stillness of the desert. Mira paused, looking toward the village and then at Arev. There was a softness in her expression, a mixture of gratitude and unspoken emotion. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but carrying warmth, "for walking with me, for noticing, for being here without needing anything in return." Arev felt a lump in his throat, and he realized that words were insufficient to express the depth of his feelings. He nodded instead, allowing the silence to convey what he could not speak. "Thank you," he replied softly, "for trusting me. For sharing yourself, even in ways you didn't have to." For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, two figures against the vast desert, the wind carrying with it a sense of quiet completion. The sun had climbed higher, painting the dunes in warm gold and shadow, and the desert seemed to hold them in a gentle embrace, marking the end of one chapter while leaving room for the next. Mira finally turned to leave, her steps deliberate and calm. Arev watched her go, feeling both admiration and a sense of loss. Yet he also knew that the desert, with all its expansiveness and quiet wisdom, had given them something enduring, an understanding that connection does not always require words, and that moments shared in presence and trust can leave lasting imprints on the heart. As he began walking back toward the village, Arev carried with him the memory of her calm gaze, the rhythm of her steps, and the quiet lessons of the desert. Each step he took felt heavier with meaning, yet lighter with clarity. He realized that the desert had given him more than a journey across sand. It had given him insight into life, into human connection, and into the strength found in vulnerability and trust. Even as he approached the village, the images of the night and early morning lingered in his mind. The soft glow of dawn over the dunes, the gentle shimmer of the oasis, and the quiet presence of Mira beside him. He knew that this experience would remain with him, a quiet treasure stored in memory, accessible whenever he needed to feel calm, connected, or reminded of the beauty that exists in noticing and being present. Arev stopped briefly on a dune, looking back at the desert stretching endlessly behind him. The sand seemed to ripple softly in the wind, as if waving farewell, and the colors of morning light reflected the subtle shifts in the landscape. He smiled faintly, feeling gratitude for the journey and for the companion who had shared it with him. Though their paths were diverging, the experience they had shared would remain, a lasting imprint of trust, quiet understanding, and shared presence. By the time he entered the village, the desert had fully transformed under the bright morning sun. Life had begun to stir, people walking through the streets, voices calling across courtyards, and the distant sounds of animals and daily chores. Yet even amidst the bustle, Arev felt the calm of the desert lingering within him. He walked with a newfound awareness, carrying the rhythm, the silence, and the subtle magic of the dunes wherever he went. And Mira, continuing on her path through the vast expanse of sand, carried her own quiet transformation. The story of loss and solitude that had shaped her had now been shared, honored, and softened by the presence of someone who walked beside her without judgment. The desert had offered healing, reflection, and companionship, leaving her with a sense of hope and the knowledge that even the most solitary paths could be enriched by connection. Though they had parted physically, the memory of their journey together, the sand underfoot, the stars above, the oasis in the quiet morning, and the trust shared between them lingered. Both Arev and Mira understood that some experiences are not measured by distance or time, but by the depth of attention, presence, and quiet empathy. Their journey had been one of observation, learning, and emotional resonance, leaving a permanent mark on their hearts. And so, the desert stood eternal, vast, and welcoming, holding the traces of their journey in the soft curves of the dunes. Arev and Mira had walked its sands, shared its quiet lessons, and carried its wisdom with them, proof that even fleeting moments, when truly experienced, can become stories that linger, guide, and inspire long after the steps have faded from sight. In that way, the desert was not just a backdrop, but a living witness to their story, a story of trust, quiet companionship, personal growth, and the enduring beauty of being fully present with another soul. And as the sun rose higher, spreading warmth across the golden sand, the echoes of their journey lingered like a soft, unforgettable melody, marking the end of one chapter and the quiet beginning of the next.